This is Jim Schwab. I'm the manager of the Hazards Planning Research Center and project manager for Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation, a project we're doing with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to rewrite the well-known 1998 Green Book on the same topic. And our Recovery News blog is part of that project, and as a result of Hurricane Sandy and the impacts of that superstorm, we're initiating a special series here of conversations with leading thinkers and figures in the field of recovery planning to take a look at what kinds of issues we may be facing in the Northeast of the United States in connection with the impacts of Hurricane Sandy. So with me today is Gavin Smith, who certainly has had some major contributions to this field. He is the executive director of the Center for the Study of Natural Hazards and Disasters at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is the author of a 2011 book titled Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery, a review of the United States Disaster Assistance Framework, which is through Island Press, and he previously, I know, has some major experience in having served as the governor's coordinator on recovery and renewal in Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina. So, Gavin, welcome, and I assume we have some very interesting topics to talk about with you. Why don't we start with the very idea of this superstorm, or what's been called by some a Frankenstorm, the interesting combination of impacts produced in Hurricane Sandy, the unique track and path that it took, how it interacted with other storm fronts within the region to produce the situation that we ended up watching so much of this week. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those interrelated impacts that you see in this particular case and what implications they have for recovery?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Sandy, I think, is unique for a number of reasons. One is its breadth, and you've mentioned that briefly, but a storm that measures somewhere approximating 2,000 miles, 1,800, 2,000 miles in breadth. The duration of the storm, it sat offshore, it caused major coastal erosion, it piled water up on the eastern seaboard. When it came onshore, significant storm surge. So the characteristics of the storm were significant. It also caused major snowfall in the Appalachian Mountains, long, intensive rainfall in major metropolitan areas with a lot of impervious surface. So there's all these issues associated with the size, the duration of the storm, but also its impact on human settlements and the form with which those human settlements exist. Some range from small barrier island communities that had not seen a storm for many years, so the building codes that were adopted prior to the advent of, for example, the Ash Wednesday storm that hit in the 60s were very different from today. So there was a major loss of houses on barrier islands that didn't meet more recent codes. Significant impacts on major urban infrastructure, transit lines, subways, rail systems, and a variety of other transportation networks of which these major urban areas depend. Major flooding in communities ranging from Manhattan to Fire Island to New Jersey. So just the breadth, the duration, and the fact that it impacted a series of major metropolitan areas really leads us to wonder, and it'll be interesting to see the extent of the damages, which still have not been fully calculated.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a storm like this hitting a more densely packed combination of urban areas than it did, short of a direct hit on Manhattan.
Right.
Can you tell us a little about what that does in terms of both the planning capacity to deal with the problem in these kinds of urban areas? It's a very different situation, I imagine, from Mississippi and Louisiana in that sense. And also the extent of damage to infrastructure in this case.
Yeah, it's in some ways, I think it's unprecedented in the U.S. for a coastal storm to impact as you said, this significant cluster of major metropolitan areas and how they're interrelated through various types of infrastructures, be they roads, bridges, subways, and so forth, telecommunications, and so on. Much of them, for example, are located underground, literally below the water table. Subways being filled with water, not being able to turn on power systems, substations in New Jersey being located in flood-prone areas, and them going out and having a cascading effect throughout the area. And then even thinking about the idea of these settlements being so dense, so densely populated, and all of the impervious surfaces and the impact it has on major urban flooding is in many ways unprecedented in the U.S.
Yeah, one of the things that you discussed extensively in your book had to do with the governance systems that come into play in recovery. Can you tell us a little bit about how that aspect of recovery is going to play out in the Northeast? I mean, this is certainly an area that is, as you said, very dense, very urban, consequently should have, we would think, a lot of complex governance systems that could be brought into play to assist recovery, but it could also make it more complicated.
It could. For example, if you were to just look at housing and the role of housing in post-disaster recovery, looking at federal, state, and local government programs, often narrowly defined to meet a very specific need and client base. In disasters, they're not necessarily targeting a particular group of people necessarily. And so how do you reconcile existing programs, both pre and post disaster, that offer aid for housing, as being one example, with the needs that may be uncovered in this event? Also thinking about all of the privately held infrastructure that is damaged, and all of the people in all of these metropolitan areas depend on that infrastructure. But if in fact it's privately owned, what role, and in fact the private sector, corporations, and these transit, the owners of this transit system, the onus will be on them to repair this. There'll be intense pressure to rebuild it back quickly, which brings up another really important issue, is this notion between the speed of recovery and the notion of stepping back and saying, should we be rebuilding our infrastructure, our communities, our housing differently? And by that I mean, how do we inject risk reduction into the reconstruction process? And if you're to do it through government, that's one way, and there's a series of grant programs that allow you to do that. Fairly cumbersome to administer, difficult to administer, but also trying to, for example, encourage the private sector to do the same. How do we do that? How do we incentivize the private sector to change the way, the location, where and how they build infrastructure? And that's just one example of the public-private partnership. Nonprofits will play a key role in distribution of aid, particularly to socially vulnerable populations and to populations that may be reticent to reach out for federal assistance. Again, given the complexities and the bureaucracies associated with federal aid, oftentimes nonprofits play a key stopgap measure. Thinking about foundations and the provision of financial aid to those people that may not be able to take out a loan. The role of insurance. Do homeowners have adequate insurance? Do coastal property owners have adequate insurance? Given that insurance is run through the private sector, with the important exception of the flood insurance program, which is a federal program. All of these issues are intertwined and connected in ways that if, in fact, you don't have a strong, robust, interconnected system of governance in place, recovery is extremely difficult.
Yeah, which also, let me raise one final question there connected with governance, which is the role of transportation, because that's clearly taken a big hit. Both of the major airports in New York City are on the waterfront, were flooded out, consequently non-functional. Some people might say, oh, well, what a great opportunity for Amtrak. No such luck. They had to do massive inspections of their tracks just to see if their tracks were acceptable to run trains, so they can't run at the same time. So in essence, nothing's running right now, right?
Right.
And of course, those airports are under the authority of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the same folks who own the World Trade Center that got hit back in 9/11. Those transportation systems introduce a number of issues in terms of funding streams to underwrite recovery, as well as who's in charge of what. Can you talk about some of those issues related to just getting people moving again in the area?
Right, that's no doubt. In fact, in places like New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, a lot of these areas, Washington, D.C., all of the communities are so reliant on public transit, and many of them are dependent on the subway system, again, which is highly vulnerable to coastal flooding. New York and New Jersey being the most recent example. It's going to be extremely difficult to dewater these facilities. In fact, they're in the process of doing that now, and I don't know how long that will take. And also given the fact that you have electrical systems and others that are adjacent to and or buried or are located underground, I should say, the idea of electrical systems getting wet, that's a bad combination. Mm-hmm. And so thinking this through, I also mentioned, the notion of substations that are going to be powering these transportation networks. They too, in many cases, particularly in New Jersey, 3 major substations were inundated by floodwaters. And so, there's all kinds of problems. More recently, saw on the news that a hospital in New York City, their secondary power system, backup generator, don't know where it was located, but it didn't seem to function. So they had to evacuate the entire hospital. And that's just one critical facility that was directly impacted, and I'm sure there are many others.
Okay. Any other broad concluding thoughts you want to offer us to end this?
Yeah, I think one of the big concerns I think a lot of us that study this and are involved in practice is, and again, people are sometimes reticent to mention this. 2 times don't necessarily make a trend, but if in fact we're going to be experiencing more coastal storms in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states that haven't had them for decades, and they're highly populated, coupled with the idea of climate change, sea level rise, perhaps intensification of storms. These issues are important for us to recognize and contemplate because the idea of abandoning New York City is not an option. On the other hand, developing massive protective infrastructures to protect these huge urban settlements is another extremely costly and in many cases problematic option as well. So the sobering question is what next?
Yeah, where do you go from here? Well, Gavin, thank you for being with us today, and for all the people watching this, I invite you to stay in touch with what's going on at APA. We will be continuing to discuss a number of possible initiatives through APA. We will be tracking those on this blog at blogs.planning.org/postdisaster. So watch for us on the Recovery News blog for further information. Thank you.